Hi there, and a very warm welcome to this video on dynamics. Dynamics are indications in written music that tell us how loud or soft we should play that music. All instruments have a range of different volume levels that they can play at, and so these markings make suggestions as to where in the range that music should sound. These can obviously change a huge amount over the course of a piece, and so we see lots of these markings all the time when we're reading music. It's really important to remember that these markings are just suggestions. It's not quite the same as the note pitches or the note lengths that we've seen so far, where G means a G and a whole note always means 4 beats. In music, loud can actually mean 100 different things, and quiet can also mean 100 different things. It really depends on your own instrument, the type of music you're playing, and where you're playing it, as to how you're going to read and interpret these dynamic or volume indications. Take this example for instance. Imagine you are playing some music to a few friends in your living room. When you see loud in the music, you're obviously going to play loud, but nowhere near as loud as if you were playing to 100,000 people at Madison Square Garden. You've got to use your ear and your musicianship to sensibly read what these suggestions mean in the context and the place that you're playing. Also, don't forget that if you're playing music from a long time ago, instruments might have changed a huge amount since the time that music was written. The piano that Mozart composed on, for example, was much quieter than the modern grand pianos that we can play on today. And so when Mozart writes loud, he probably doesn't mean quite as loud as when Shostakovich says loud, because Shostakovich will have composed on a much more modern, much louder instrument. So with this in mind, let's go and have a look at some of the standard symbols relating to dynamics or volume level in music. In some of the earliest music compositions, composers used dynamic markings to differentiate simply loud from soft. The way composers did this was to mark the quiet sections with piano, which means soft or quiet in Italian. And the sections that were louder and more confident would have been marked forte, which also in Italian means strong or loud. Now of course it would take up lots of space on the music if we had to write out forte and piano every time we wanted the musicians to change their dynamic level. So instead we use F for forte and P for piano for short. You might have heard these words before, because together they make the name of an instrument, the pianoforte, or the piano for short. The piano was a really special instrument when it was first invented, because it was the first time that an instrument played with a keyboard could achieve loud sounds and quiet sounds purely through the touch of the player. Of course, lots of instruments have always been able to change the level of volume that they're playing at. And this is not to say that earlier music was completely empty of dynamics and the composers didn't care about whether you were playing loud or soft. It just seems that more of these decisions were something that was left up to the performer to decide. And that makes a huge amount of sense because what level you're going to play at kind of depends completely on the size of the room and the sort of audience that you're playing to. But over time, composers start to want more ways to suggest slightly more subtle changes in volume or dynamic level in their music, and so we start to see a few more symbols appear. MP and MF, for example, fill in the space between loud and soft, because they stand for Mezzo piano and mezzo forte, Italian for moderately quiet and moderately loud. Also in time, more dynamic suggestions start to appear at either end of the spectrum of volume. Composers start to use fortissimo, represented by 2 Fs, and pianissimo, represented by 2 Ps, to sounds that are really quiet or really loud in the music. And in some more modern pieces, we even go further than that to see 3 Fs, 4 Fs, or even 5 Fs to represent really loud sounds, almost unusually loud sounds. And equally, at the other end of the spectrum, 3 Ps, 4 Ps, and 5 Ps, although these are relatively rare. Now, all these letter symbols do is give us a suggested volume level that we should play at. But I'm sure we all know that some of the most powerful techniques we can use in music involve gradually getting louder and gradually getting softer. In other words, a change of dynamic level. I'm sure we all know the soundtrack from the movie Jaws. The reason that's so scary is the fact that Jaws' two-note melody comes from nowhere, from a pianissimo in the distance, to right up close on top of us at fortissimo, and everybody's playing that melody. So the way we tell the player in notated music to get louder and softer are with two things: the crescendo, getting louder, and the diminuendo, getting quieter. These words are quite long, and so they're often difficult to write down in the music. There's often not enough space. So instead, we use some shortcuts. Cresc, C-R-E-S-C, and dim are the shortened forms of crescendo and diminuendo. And when we see these in music, we should think about getting louder and getting softer. Another way to represent gradual change in volume level in music is with a hairpin. A hairpin is just two lines that move away from each other to indicate getting louder and move towards each other to indicate getting quieter. In this example, this hairpin is telling us to get louder over the course of 2 bars. Likewise, in this example, the hairpin is telling us to get quieter over the course of 2 bars. So that's gradual change in volume level taken care of, but sometimes we need to change our volume level incredibly suddenly. I'm sure we've all sat through horror movies where the soundtrack has surprised and shocked us by changing its level incredibly quickly. Most of the time, when the monster's about to jump out, we're lulled into a false sense of security by hearing some very quiet music that goes underneath what's happening, and then suddenly, as the monster appears, we hear something incredibly loud, and that can be a really effective technique to use in music. If you see the word sub, which is short for Italian, subito, suddenly, in music, that's telling us we're going to change our dynamic level and really make the point of the fact that it's changed. So you might be playing pianissimo for a while, so you have the 2 P's marking, and then suddenly a chord or something will come along that has the sub F marking, and that means that you're supposed to use that as an opportunity to really surprise your listener with this change in dynamic, and it can be an incredibly powerful tool. I've seen audiences jump out of their seat because of a really well played subito, forte or fortissimo. So that's it. Those are pretty much all the symbols that you need to know that deal with loud and soft in written music. But of course, it's really easy to learn the symbols. What's difficult is to learn how those symbols map on to the music that you're playing. It all depends on where you're playing it, who you're playing it with, and what the music is. And the only way to learn that is to get out there and do lots of playing, and more importantly, do lots of listening.